The desert wind howled across the barbed wire fence, carrying with it the sting of dust and heat. Inside the training camp, recruits stood in formation, their boots sinking slightly into the sand. And then her, a lone figure out of place, stepping into their line as though she didn't belong. She was lean, almost fragile compared to the others, her hair tied back in a low knot, a pale scar tracing down from her temple to her neck. The scar alone invited questions, but none were asked aloud. Instead, there was laughter. "Is this our new recruit?" One voice mocked from the back. "She looks more like a stray than a soldier." Another chuckled, louder. "Maybe someone should teach her which end of a rifle points forward." I remember that moment vividly. I've witnessed new recruits mocked before, but never like this. The difference was her silence. She didn't protest, didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, eyes locked forward, as though every insult dissolved into the desert wind. Have you ever seen someone shoved into the corner, unwanted, and thought to yourself, "She won't last a day"? That's exactly what every man here believed. But instead of breaking, she stood unshaken, the sun beating down on her face, sweat dripping slowly, yet her posture unyielding. The sergeant's voice cut through the murmurs. "Why are you here?" "To prove that the broken remains of some forgotten battle can still walk." Her answer came in two words, steady, quiet, and sharp enough to cut through the heat. "To learn." In this place, those words sounded almost absurd. No one came to this desert to learn. They came to prove themselves, to survive the most brutal gauntlet the military could design. And yet she, scarred, frail, unarmed in every way but silence, dared to say she was here to learn. I stood on the sidelines, my thoughts torn. Was she naive? Was she insane? Or was there something deeper in those eyes, something everyone else had missed? The barracks erupted again in laughter and derision. Soldiers shook their heads, some smirking, others muttering, "She won't last 3 days." But I noticed something no one else cared to see. In her silence, in the way she stood with her hands steady at her sides, there was fire. A quiet fire, hidden deep but unmistakable once you looked for it. This was not just another recruit about to be broken. This was the beginning of something none of us could predict. The insults still echoed, the sand still whipped around us, the sun still burned above. And yet, something had already shifted. Because why would someone like her, scarred, silent, underestimated, appear in this place? Why no? Why here? But the only question that mattered was this: why would someone like her appear here at all? The days that followed were merciless. At dawn, the desert was already hot enough to sting the skin. By noon, it was unbearable. And every hour in between, the recruits were pushed to the edge of exhaustion. She was the weakest link, or so they thought. During the morning runs, boots pounding against the cracked earth, the squad pulled ahead, leaving her in the dust. "Keep up, or go home," someone shouted, laughing as they surged forward. By the time she reached the checkpoint, her chest heaving, the others were already resting, smirks spread across their faces. On the firing range, the mockery grew sharper. They handed her a standard-issue rifle, heavy for someone of her frame. The first shot jolted her shoulder back, the recoil making her stumble. Snickers broke out. Pathetic. Even the recoil's too much for her. I stood watching, and I'll admit, part of me wanted to believe them. It's easier to dismiss someone who doesn't fit. Easier to laugh, easier to forget. But when I looked closer, her silence unsettled me. She never shouted back, never cursed under her breath. She simply listened. Every insult, every order, every moment, it all sank into her like water into stone. At the obstacle course, things turned cruel. The ropes burned her palms raw. The walls left dust and bruises along her arms. When she fell hard into the sand, a recruit whispered just loud enough for the others to hear, "She should have stayed behind the kitchen line." And the others laughed, the kind of laughter that doesn't stop until it stings. But through every jeer, she pulled herself back to her feet. No complaints, no excuses, just steady breaths and eyes forward. And yet no one noticed the detail. No one but me. Because humiliation was only the surface. Beneath it, something else stirred. But no one knew. Not yet. But no one knew that in her silence, she was watching them more closely than they could imagine. It began with the smallest moments. One night, after lights out, I saw her outside, kneeling by the weapons rack. At first, I thought she was fumbling with a rifle out of desperation. But as I stepped closer, I realized her hands weren't fumbling at all. They were precise, intentional. She stripped the weapon down piece by piece, faster than most recruits even dared, the moonlight reflecting off polished metal. A scar like hers wasn't just for show. And her movements, they weren't the movements of a rookie. They were the movements of someone who had touched a rifle long before this camp. The next day, during a desert navigation drill, the recruits fumbled with compasses, swore under their breath, argued about bearings. She said nothing. Instead, her eyes swept the horizon. She read the wind, the dunes, the sun's angle. She stepped forward first, walking straight toward the checkpoint. Hours later, when the squad realized she had led them to the correct mark, no one said a word. They pretended it hadn't happened. But I noticed. And then there was the scar. A jagged mark running down her face and neck. At first, it seemed like an accident, a reminder of some tragic past. But when the others joked about it, calling her damaged goods, her jaw tightened, not in shame, but in control. That scar wasn't weakness. It was memory. Every night, as the recruits collapsed into their bunks, she lingered a little longer, stretching, sharpening her focus. Her movements bore the discipline of someone who had trained before, someone who wasn't new to pain. And still, the others didn't see. They didn't want to see. But the truth was simple. She was hiding something. And she was hiding it well. And then, one detail, so small it almost went unnoticed, brought the entire barracks to silence. That night, a storm raged across the desert, lightning cracking the horizon, wind rattling the camp's walls. A sentry dropped his rifle as the thunder roared, the weapon clattering against the concrete. The chamber jammed. He cursed, fumbling in panic. Before he could blink, she stepped forward. In a single motion, she picked it up, stripped it down, cleared the chamber, reloaded, and handed it back, done in less than 6 seconds. No words. No explanation. The barracks, noisy only moments before, fell utterly silent. It was in that silence that I saw it, the first fracture in their arrogance, the first shadow of doubt in their laughter. Because now, a question began to creep into their minds. Who was she really? And the truth is, they had no idea. And then, one small detail made the entire squad fall silent. Dawn bled slowly into the camp, a thin silver line at the horizon, and with it came a quieter rhythm. Orders still barked, boots still struck sand, but something in the air had changed, a small tension, a question that hadn't been asked aloud yet. She moved through the morning like a shadow with purpose. Not rushing, not faltering, simply precise. On the range, the instructors set steel at routine distances. She waited until the others had finished their noisy competition for scores and bragging rights. Then she lifted her hand, barely a gesture, almost an apology, and asked for the far lane. Wind cut across the flats in shallow gusts, flattening the scrub. She lay prone, set the bipod, and did nothing for a long moment but watch the mirage dance. The spotter grew impatient. She didn't answer him. Her eyes moved, measuring heat shimmer, noting the angle of a torn flag at the boundary fence, counting heartbeats between gusts. Her first round broke the quiet. A clean ring rolled across the desert from a target most recruits couldn't even see without glass. The spotter blinked as her next 3 shots landed wide but equidistant in the same direction. It looked like an error until she spun the dial in careful, deliberate clicks and fired the 5th. Steel sang again, this time centered. The group tightened to a single ragged coin of impact. Distance be damned. She rose wordlessly, brushing sand from her elbow. No grin. No gloating. Just a small nod as if to say the rifle had finally agreed with the wind. No one clapped. Yet the silence was not the old silence of contempt. It was attention. Later, during radios, a lieutenant wrestled with a finicky set, static flooding the channel. She held out a palm, and the device was surrendered to her without argument. Her fingers moved in a rapid pattern that didn't come from any handbook the others knew: reset, bypass, manual frequency entry, key fill sequence, a brief tap that married an old encryption habit to a new set of rules. The hiss collapsed into a clean tone. She keyed twice, spoke a few clipped words on a channel labeled hush that didn't exist on their training diagram, and handed the radio back. The lieutenant stared, said nothing, and scribbled the sequence on the inside of his wrist. At navigation, the squad followed the textbook: bearings, compasses, arguments. She watched the sand, the grain of it, the way it gathered in the lee of scrub like a whispered answer. She kept them off the ridge that looked right but wasn't, steering by the angle of shadows and the thin arc of cloud that told of a dry wind funneling through a gap miles away. When they reached the checkpoint and the instructor lifted a brow, a recruit opened his mouth to credit luck. Then he saw her hands, scarred knuckles resting lightly at her sides still. Not luck. Small moments, each one. Yet together they began to feel like a map of a person no one had understood. At mess, she ate in silence, as always. But her tray bore a logic the others recognized only in hindsight: salt for the heat bleed, sugars for the quick climb, protein stacked for the long burn. She drank slowly, exact amounts. No lecture, no comment. The body, like the rifle, was just another system to shape through patience and data. In the yard that evening, she wrapped her palms and climbed the rope without a grunt, using legs only to break, ascending hand over hand with a mechanic's economy. Halfway up, she paused, not to rest, but to listen. A shout had snapped sharp across the yard, the clipped cry that comes when a joint goes wrong. She dropped lightly, crossed to the obstacle course where a recruit had taken a bad landing and turned his ankle. Before the medic reached them, she had the boot unlaced, the swelling cinched, the foot elevated against a pack. No fuss, no flourish, just a small, steady pressure applied exactly where it would do the most good. The recruit, who had called her dead weight a day before, stared up with the startled gratitude of someone saved from pain sooner than he deserved. Night drew a hard line along the perimeter. In the barracks, where bravado usually fermented, conversation shifted. The jokes grew fewer, quieter, only half believed. Someone asked where she'd learned to read wind like that. Another muttered that the radio trick was a fluke. The one with the taped ankle said nothing at all. The next day, an instructor introduced a discipline none of them had expected to see at a training camp designed for breaking bodies and forging habits: patience under pressure. A timed drill through a maze of walls and tight corners ended not at a flag, but at a scenario: two targets interlaced, one hostage, one hostile, a laser tripwire, and a bait door that would cost them points. She walked in last, watched what the others missed, and used what she had that the rest did not: the ability to be still while thinking. 2 breaths. A foot pivot to avoid the tripwire by millimeters. A hand up to signal a move not taught here, an old gesture, fluid as a tide. Then one step, one measured angle, and a single suppressed crack from a training pistol that the instructor swore later he hadn't even heard. The hostage silhouette didn't flutter. The hostile dropped like a thought leaving a room. The instructor's eyes narrowed. Not with suspicion, something like recognition. In the shower room's humming light, the scar on her neck drew the kind of glances that had once been cruel. Now they were curious. It wasn't merely a cut left by accident. Close up, it had edges that told a story: surgery, field care, the kind of neat brutality that comes when there is no time and no sterile table. The rumor that had always been a stale joke, "She isn't real military," curled on itself and began to become a new rumor with teeth. Maybe she was something else. Equipment checks became a quiet theater. She handled metal with the reverence of someone who'd lost and regained life by degrees of torque. A step bolt surrendered to the exact pressure of 2 fingers and a tapped hinge pin. A jam that caused another recruit to curse himself hoarse vanished beneath the mercy of her patience. The quartermaster watched her inventory a kit bag and said, without looking at her, "You've done this before." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Then came a test none of them had trained for. The desert threw a hard problem at them. A supply vehicle overheated on the edge of the flats, far from shade or shelter, the sun turning the hood to a griddle. The radios crackled to life and died again. Water sloshed low. She took charge without taking anything from anyone. A poncho became a condenser line. She ran lengths of tubing from a spare canteen capped to a shallow trough, used the temperature gradient under the vehicle's shadow to draw moisture out of the air. It was meager, a handful of sips, but the difference between panic and calm is sometimes one cool mouthful that says the world still obeys laws. A wisp of a name appeared that evening, not on lips, but in the pause between them. Blackbird. Not spoken, not claimed. A story recruits tell when they're sore and half asleep, a ghost program, a unit that never signed logs, a set of skills taught off the books and in the dark. The instructors didn't repeat the rumor. They didn't have to. One of them moved closer when she was on the range and watched the way she read wind through fabric, not through guesswork. Another traced his thumb over an old service coin and said, in a voice meant for himself alone, "Haven't seen that cadence in a decade." She wasn't friendly. She wasn't cold. She was true. And the unit felt the first tug of a new gravity. Where jeers had once been easy, now they stuck in the throat. Where contempt had once been currency, now it felt counterfeit. Respect hadn't arrived, not yet. But hope had. Hope looked like her shadow falling longer than her frame. It sounded like a silence that listened instead of judged. It tasted like a trace of clean radio on a noisy day. It breathed like the calm that enters a room when someone capable decides to stay. At dusk, the sky went bronze, the kind of color that makes the world feel deeper than it is. She sat alone on the edge of the yard, disassembling a rifle by touch, laying parts in a line as neat as prayer beads. Overhead, the floodlight snapped on. The metal caught the light and threw it back in thin, cutting slivers. She checked the bull face with the pad of her thumb, fell for the burr that didn't exist, and replaced the carrier with a care that was almost tender. No one taught tenderness here. She carried it anyway. By then, the question had changed. It was no longer will she last? The camp had moved on to a better, sharper terror. What happens when we finally see what she really is? They would see soon. The final trial was already written on the schedule board in meat letters. Night assault, full sim, no quarter. Recruits would be split, blindfolded, disoriented, then turned loose into a maze where everything they'd learned would either hold or snap. They had seen her skill emerge in fragments: wind, radio, anatomy, patience. But they had not seen the whole of it gathered, sharpened, and aimed. They hadn't seen everything, not until the final trial began. Night fell like a blade. The desert air, blistering by day, turned cold and sharp, cutting through fabric, sinking into bone. Floodlights shut down one by one until the camp was swallowed in black. Then came the order. Blindfolds on, weapons live, simulation begins. Recruits were herded into trucks, dropped at scattered points across a maze of ruined structures and low dunes. The final trial was designed for chaos. No maps, no guidance, only the command, survive. Capture the flag, neutralize threats, trust no one. The laughter that once followed her was gone now, replaced by uneasy silence. No one dared to bet against her anymore. But still, no one imagined what would come next. The whistle shrieked. The trial began. Gunfire cracked in the distance, blink rounds, simulation tech, but real enough to burn nerves raw. Shadows darted, boots thundered against sand and concrete. Recruits scrambled like hunted animals, alliances forming and breaking in minutes. She moved differently. While others stumbled, she glided. While others shouted, she listened. She pressed her body close to the wall of a half-buried bunker, breathing in rhythm with the silence, scanning the dark not with panic but with patience. A flare burst overhead, painting the ground in white fire. 3 figures sprinted for cover, unaware she was watching. One dropped into prone, aiming wild into the dark. Another tripped, cursing, giving away their position. She didn't fire. Not yet. She waited until they revealed their angles, their spacing. Then she shifted one step, just enough to catch the wind's curve through a narrow alley. Her rifle barked once. The first figure jerked, sensor flashing red. She rolled left, 2 more quick shots, controlled, exact. By the time the flare's light burned out, 3 bodies lay neutralized, their vests signaling elimination. She slipped into the shadows again, already moving before silence returned. Elsewhere, chaos ruled. Recruits screamed, stumbled, fell into the traps the instructors had laid, wire-sound mines, dead zones where comms cut to static. But she was building something else. I watched it unfold from the control room, screens glowing, instructors muttering. She wasn't just surviving, she was directing the chaos. Every shot she fired pushed the others closer together, into tighter alleys, into dead corners where panic would breed. Every step she took wasn't for escape, it was to herd. On screen, a recruit lunged around a corner. She met him hand to hand, their rifles colliding in a violent clang. The others watching leaned forward, expecting her to falter. She didn't. One twist, one strike, and he hit the dirt, chest sensor buzzing defeat. She never even looked back. The sergeant next to me whispered, "That's not camp training. That's field doctrine." The climax came fast. A squad of 4 had managed to corner themselves near the central flag tower, pinned by crossfire. Panic bled into their voices, their shots scattering wide. They were seconds from elimination when she appeared. Not charging, not reckless. Calm. She dropped into cover beside them, silent as a ghost. One recruit cursed at her arrival. Another hissed, "We're done for." She ignored them. Her hands moved over their rifles, correcting grips, adjusting angles. Her eyes flicked to the rooftop where 2 enemies crouched. She signaled 2 fingers, then a sweep left. It wasn't a signal the recruits had been taught, but instinct carried them. On her mark, 2 rifles fired suppression. She rose, stepped into the open, and in a single motion, took the high ground shooters out with surgical precision. The recruits froze. For a moment, they just stared. Then, as if something larger than pride had cracked inside them, they followed her lead. She stormed the tower, every movement fluid, exact. A tripwire detonated, she rolled, came up steady, weapon raised. The final defenders held their ground, but she broke them one by one, her body a seamless line of motion. A flashbang burst white. She closed her eyes a fraction of a second before, turned her face, then struck through the dazzle as if she'd rehearsed it 100 times. By the time the smoke cleared, the flag was in her hand. And the trial, the chaos, the noise, the mockery, the disbelief was over. The yard was silent when the recruits returned. Sensors beeped off, helmets came loose, boots dragged. Faces stared at her not with ridicule anymore, but with something else, something heavier. Shock. Respect clawing its way up through denial. The same voices that had once mocked her now spoke only in whispers. She took the tower. She saved them. She commanded. Even the instructors, hardened men who'd seen more than most soldiers dreamt of, stood quiet. The sergeant who'd once mocked her voice cracked when he finally spoke, after tonight. Who dares call her weak? And no one answered. That night, under the dim light of the barracks, she sat alone as always. But the silence around her had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with eyes, with unspoken questions, with the weight of recognition. She hadn't demanded respect. She hadn't asked for it. She had earned it, through fire, through control, through a skill none of them could deny. And in that moment, I realized something. We had all been wrong. The scar, the silence, the frail figure, none of it was weakness. It was camouflage, a mask. Because what lived beneath it was something far stronger. And from that night on, no one would ever mistake her for anything less than what she truly was. Morning arrived with a clean, unwavering light, the kind that makes edges precise and excuses disappear. The yard filled slowly, boots aligning, shoulders squaring. She stood at the end of the formation, the flag from last night folded perfectly in her hands, corner sharp as a blade. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence itself had learned her name. The commanding officer walked out, cap under one arm, face unreadable. He stopped in front of her. The line seemed to tilt, as if pulled by a new gravity. She presented the flag in a single motion, crisp and spare. He took it, paused, and then did something none of us expected. He lifted his hand to his brow and saluted her first. A breath moved through the unit. Not sound, but a shift of weight. A quiet admission. The sergeant who had mocked her flinched as if struck, then clenched his jaw and mirrored the salute. One by one, the line followed. No words. Only the discipline of recognition. I felt heat behind my ribs, a mix of shame and pride. I had watched her arrive alone, watched her endure, and then watched her change the ground under our feet. I had seen many recruits force respect with volume. She had earned it with restraint. It is a strange thing to witness the moment a person becomes what they already were, and the rest of us finally catch up. The officer unfolded the flag himself and returned it to her, a gesture reserved for those who understood weight. Well carried, he said, the phrase formal yet softened by something like gratitude. Then he let a smaller sentence fall, quiet enough to pass only among those who were listening. Blackbird 7. A call sign, not a rumor. Not shouted. A truth given, not pried loose. Her eyes flicked once, not surprise, not pride. Acceptance. She slipped the folded cloth beneath her arm and stepped back into rank. The recruit with the taped ankle, who had laughed first and loudest, shifted closer, just enough to make space for her. You saved my night, he said, voice low. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The space he gave her was answer enough. In the mess hall, trays that once turned away now turned aside for her to pass. A canteen slid across a table, offered without condition. On the range, two soldiers adjusted their stances exactly as she had corrected them in the dark, never claiming the lesson as their own. In the radio shed, a lieutenant relabeled a channel according to what she'd keyed quietly the day before. Hush became standard. No one questioned it. By evening, the camp had taken on her rhythm. Not slower, truer. The officers met her gaze as an equal. The sergeant's voice lost its curl of contempt. And when the sun dipped and the yard went gold, she crossed it under that warm light with the flag against her side, the scar on her neck no longer an invitation for laughter, but a line of history no one dared misread. The salute became the symbol. But there were others, her call signs spoken without being asked, the way conversation eased when she entered a room, the straightening of spines that had nothing to do with fear, and the simple, indelible fact that respect had taken root and would not be uprooted. I had thought I understood strength. I hadn't. Not until I saw it move without spectacle, set as standard, and leave the rest of us changed by its passing. She did not demand the unit's respect. She became the reason we remembered how to give it. Do you want to know what happened after everything was revealed?